They had powdered 4 faces for him that night. Nobody had thought to powder hers, because nobody expected him to look. Lucia Bianchi sat where she'd been placed, off to the side on a cream couch, too far from the window to matter, her cane resting against the cushion, her hands folded in her lap, the way her father had taught her to fold them, still small out of the way. She wasn't part of the line. She'd never been part of the line. 9 years ago, someone had decided that a blind girl couldn't be sold as a wife, only loaned out as a chaperone to make the real merchandise look respectable, and nobody in the Bianchi house had revisited that decision since. So while her 4 cousins were dressed in gold sequins and deep emerald and blue silk slit to the thigh, Lucia wore cream, plain, unremarkable cream, chosen specifically so she would not draw the eye of a man who was about to be given his pick of the family. Nobody powders the furniture. Nobody dresses the chaperone. She had made her peace with that a long time ago, or told herself she had, which after 9 years starts to feel like the same thing. She could hear the room before she could have seen it, if seeing had ever been on offer. Marble underfoot, cold and enormous. The particular hush of floor-to-ceiling glass holding back 40 floors of city. A chandelier, she'd been told once, looked like frozen rain. Somewhere to her left, Elena's breathing had gone shallow and fast, the nervous rhythm Lucia had memorized when they were children. And Elena couldn't sleep during a storm. Elena, always the one worth dressing. The Bianchi name had bought this room, barely. Renzo Bianchi had spent a decade trading his daughters like currency he didn't have to earn, first offering Elena's beauty as collateral for peace with the Morettis, and when a loan hadn't been enough to guarantee an invitation, adding Lucia to the lineup the way you'd throw in a second item nobody wanted, just to close the deal. Bring the blind one too. It'll look like tradition. Nobody expected her to be chosen. She wasn't there to be chosen. She was there to make 5 daughters look like an offering instead of a transaction. This was what a choosing was. Underneath the marble and the crystal and the careful language, a boss selects a bride, the way he'd select a business partner, and everyone in the room agrees, out loud, to call it romance. Lucia understood the arithmetic of it better than anyone in that room, because she'd been raised inside it. A daughter's worth measured by what she photographed as, what she could be traded for, how well she disappeared when the men wanted the room to themselves. She had spent 9 years perfecting the second skill, since she'd shown early and permanent proof she'd never be any good at the first. She hadn't always been so good at disappearing. She remembered. She still had the memory, even without the sight. Being 11 years old and practicing a recital piece for 3 months on their mother's old piano, timing it, so her father would have no excuse, so he'd have to come. He hadn't come. He'd taken Elena to get her a dress instead, because Elena had cried about a dress, and Lucia's silence had never once bought her anything. She'd played to an empty seat, with her father's name still taped to the back of it, and she had not cried, because even then she understood crying was a currency that only worked if people could see your face doing it, so she'd stopped spending it. She built herself, brick by brick, into something a family could use and never had to look at. That was the whole shape of tonight as far as Lucia was concerned. Sit still, be furniture, get Elena through it. Then the doors opened. Not the side doors the staff used all evening, but the tall ones at the end of the room, the kind that displaced air when they moved. The room went quiet in a way Lucia had never heard a room go quiet before. Not polite silence. Wait. He came in alone. She could tell that much from the single set of footsteps. Unhurried, deliberate, each one landing like it had already decided where the room would end. Someone near her, one of the cousins, maybe Camila, made a small sound low in her throat. The kind of sound 4 women in expensive dresses make when the man they've been dressed for turns out to be exactly as dangerous as the rumors promised. Enzo Moretti didn't announce himself. He didn't have to. Lucia had heard his name spoken in her father's house the way people speak about weather that's already killed someone. A boss who'd taken control of his family at an age too young to have earned it and held it for years against men who should have beaten him. A man people swore never raised his voice and never needed to. A man, the story said, who never forgot a voice once he'd heard it. She heard him cross the room, slow, unhurried steps, moving down the line the family's counselor had arranged. Camila, then the twins, then Elena, whose breath caught so hard Lucia heard it 3 seats away. He paused there. Lucia felt her whole chest go cold, felt herself already rehearsing what she'd say, what she'd do if the next sound in this room was her father closing a deal on her sister's life. The footsteps didn't stop. They kept coming. Past Elena, past the line, toward the couch. Nobody had bothered to dress. Lucia went very still, the way she always did when she couldn't read a room, listening harder, trying to place what was happening from sound alone. Someone near the window said something sharp and confused. Fabric shifted, and then the footsteps stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could feel the air change, could smell cedar and rain on wool. Nobody spoke. The whole room was holding its breath around her, like something about to break. "It's you," he said. Lucia's hands went still in her lap. "I'm sorry, I think there's been some." "I've made my choice," he said, not to her, to the room. Flat, final, a door closing somewhere far away. The counselor's voice, alarmed, cutting through the marble hush. "Signor, the young ladies are by the window." "I know where they are." His voice hadn't moved an inch from where it was pointed. "I said I've made my choice." And Lucia Bianchi, who had spent 9 years learning exactly how to not be seen in a room full of people looking for someone to blame, sat very still and understood for the first time in her life that she had failed. The counselor recovered first. Men who spent their lives translating power into acceptable language always did. "Signor." He said it again, softer this time, the way you'd talk someone back from a ledge. "Perhaps you misheard the arrangement. The young ladies by the window, Signorina Marchetti, Signorina Ferro. Each of these families has prepared for this evening for months. This." A pause. Lucia could hear him choosing the word the way you'd choose a stone to step on. "This seating was not intended as part of the presentation. I didn't ask what was intended." Enzo hadn't moved. His voice hadn't changed pitch, hadn't risen. And somehow that was worse than shouting would have been. Shouting could be reasoned with, waited out. This was just fact, laid down like a hand of cards nobody else got to see before the deal. "I said I made my choice. If that's a problem for the arrangement, take it up with whoever wrote the arrangement. It isn't me." Somewhere behind Lucia, near the window, a woman exhaled. Not relief, not yet, just the sound of a held breath given somewhere else to go. Camila, maybe, or one of the twins. It didn't matter which. Lucia catalogued the room the only way she had left to her. Sound, weight, the small shift of expensive fabric as 5 women who had spent a year being told they were the prize realized. In real time, they weren't. Her father moved before he spoke. She heard it in his shoes. The too fast, too eager click of a man closing a gap he hadn't planned on closing. Renzo Bianchi's voice arrived a half-second later, already smoothed over, already performing. "Signor Moretti, an honor, truly. An honor. Dick. Unexpected honor. A beat. And underneath the practiced warmth, Lucia could hear him working, the way she'd learned to hear him work her whole life, turning a catastrophe into a deal in the space of 1 sentence. She's a wonderful girl. Devoted. Quiet. She'll make you a fine." "I wasn't asking your opinion of her," Enzo said, and for the first time something sharpened underneath the flatness. A blade turned just slightly toward the light. "I was informing the room." Her father went silent. It was, Lucia thought, possibly the first time in her life she'd heard him do that on command. She could imagine the rest of it without needing to see it. Could imagine, because she'd watched her father's mind work from the inside her whole life, the exact machinery behind his silence. He wasn't grieving the wrong daughter being chosen. He was recalculating. 9 years of treating her like a line item nobody collected on. And now, apparently, the line item had value after all, and he had absolutely no idea yet what that value was worth, or how fast he could spend it. 2 seats down, Elena hadn't said anything at all. Lucia knew her sister's silences too, knew the particular quality of this one thin and held together with tape, the sound of someone standing very still, because if they moved they might do something as unforgivable as cry from relief. Elena had spent the last hour rehearsing the sentence she'd have to say yes to. Lucia understood without needing an explanation exactly what his sister was feeling in this moment, because she'd have felt it too. The sick, guilty flood of a bullet missing you and hitting someone else instead. Elena would apologize for it later. She always did. She'd corner Lucia in some hallway tonight or tomorrow and say something soft and useless like, "I didn't want this. I never wanted this for you." And she'd mean it. And it still wouldn't undo 9 years of Lucia standing exactly where she was standing tonight. So Elena never had to. Near the far wall, unremarked and unbothered, a man watched the whole unraveling with the particular stillness of someone doing arithmetic. Dominic Vitali hadn't come tonight to marry off a daughter. The Vitali family had sent no bride, only an observer. The safe kind of ally a man sends when he wants to be owed a favor without spending anything to earn it. He said nothing. He didn't need to. He simply watched Renzo Bianchi's face go through shock. Then calculation. Then the beginnings of a smile he was trying very hard not to wear yet. And Vitali filed all of it away in the part of his mind where he kept things that weren't useful yet, but would be. Lucia knew none of this. Not Vitali's name, not his presence, not the particular shape of the debt he was quietly deciding to collect on someday. All she had was sound and silence, and a man standing close enough that she could still smell cedar and rain on wool, and the fact that nobody in this room, including her, had any idea why he was still standing there. So she asked him, because reading a room the way the rest of them did wasn't a door open to her, and she'd never once in her whole life learned to survive by waiting quietly for someone else to explain things she was owed an explanation for. Why me? The room went very still around the question. She could feel it, the particular held-breath quality of 40 people realizing the furniture had spoken. She didn't care. She turned her face up toward where his voice had come from, chin level, the way her mother had taught her to hold it before her mother died. And there was no one left to remind her. "You don't know me. I've been in this room less than an hour, seated at the edge, in the dress they gave me so I wouldn't distract from the ones you were supposed to choose. So I'm asking you directly, since apparently nobody else in this room is going to. Why me?" For a moment he didn't answer. She heard him breathe, actually heard it, a small catch. A man deciding how much of the truth a room full of strangers was allowed to have. "I know your voice," he said finally. Lucia frowned. "I don't know you." "I know," he said. "That's not what I said." It wasn't an answer. It was the opposite of one. A door opened onto another door, locked. She had never in her life met Enzo Moretti. She would have remembered a voice like that, low and unhurried, and entirely without the performative warmth every other man in her father's circle wore like cologne. She hadn't. She was certain of it, the way she was certain of very few things anymore. "I don't understand," she said, and hated, faintly, how young it made her sound. "You will," he said, not unkindly, almost, though she couldn't have said why she thought it, carefully. Then, quieter, meant only for her, though the whole silent room could hear it anyway. "I'd like to speak with you, alone, before tonight's over." Behind her, she heard her father start to answer for her, the old reflex, 9 years deep. Of course, she'd be honored. And for the first time in her life, Lucia spoke over him. "All right," she said. And the room, which had already gone silent once tonight, found a new and different way to hold its breath. 3 years earlier, the stairwell smelled like rust and cigarette smoke that wasn't his. Enzo Moretti sat on the third landing from the top, back against the concrete, one hand pressed flat against his side where the blood had gone from hot to cold to something he was trying not to think about. Above him, the door to the roof hung open on a broken hinge, letting in November air, and the sound of the city doing what it always did. Indifferent, enormous, uninterested in whether a 26-year-old man bled out 14 floors above it. His cousin had planned it well, not well enough. Enzo was still breathing, which meant somebody's math had been wrong somewhere, but well enough that the two men who'd come with knives instead of guns because guns left noise and noise left witnesses, were now on the floor below him. And he was up here, alone, with a wound he hadn't decided yet whether to be afraid of. He remembered, with the strange clarity, shock sometimes hands a person right before it takes everything else away, thinking, nobody is coming, not backup, not family. He'd told no one where he was going tonight because the whole point had been that no one was supposed to know. And now the privacy that had almost gotten him killed was also going to be the thing that let him die quietly on a landing without an audience. That was when he heard her on the stairs. Slow steps, careful ones. feeling for the edge of each stair the way people did when they didn't trust their eyes or didn't have eyes to trust. He'd gone still, one hand finding the gun he no longer had the strength to lift properly, and waited to find out what kind of ending this was going to be. "There's blood on the third step," she said, before she'd even reached him. Not a question, not an alarm, just a fact, delivered the way you'd mention rain. "I felt it before I smelled it," which is a strange way to learn something's wrong. "You should go back down," he'd said, or tried to. His voice hadn't done what he asked it to. "I heard that part," she said. "I'm choosing not to." She kept coming, cane tapping once against the landing, and then she was actually sitting a few feet from him, back against the same wall, like this was a bus stop and not the ugliest night of his life. "I'm not going to touch you. I don't know what's under your hands, and I don't want to make it worse by guessing. But I'll sit here if you want company, or I'll sit here anyway. It's not really up to you." He should have told her to leave. He remembered thinking that clearly, even through the fog, that whoever she was, this landing was the worst possible place for her to be tonight, that his cousin's men were still somewhere in this building, that being near him right now was its own kind of injury. He opened his mouth to say all of it. What came out instead was, "Okay." They talked for over an hour. She never asked his name. She never asked what had happened to him, who'd done it, what he'd done to deserve it or not deserve it. None of the questions a stranger would normally spend a bleeding man's patience on. Instead, she told him with the flat, unhurried confidence of someone who had survived several of her own worst nights, that pain like this came in waves, and the trick was not fighting the wave, just outlasting it. She told him the people who wanted to die usually announced it loudly, needing an audience to talk them out of it, and that the quiet ones, the ones like him, silent and doing math in the dark, usually weren't actually deciding to die. They were deciding whether it was worth the effort to keep choosing not to. Different question, better odds. "You don't know anything about me," he'd said. "I know you're still talking," she said. "That's the only statistic that matters tonight." At some point, without either of them announcing it, his hand had stopped shaking. At some point, the numbers in his head, how much blood, how many minutes, how many floors to the street, had gone quiet enough to let him hear her instead. She had a voice like something worn smooth by water, unhurried, entirely without the performance every other voice in his life carried. He'd have known it blind in a room of 100 women, and had for 3 years in restaurants, in cars, on phone lines, hearing a syllable that almost matched and turning too fast, always wrong, always disappointed in a way he never let himself examine too closely. She'd left before the ambulance his own men finally found him with arrived. He never learned why she'd been in that stairwell in the first place, in that part of the city alone at that hour. He never asked her name. She never asked his. It had felt, at the time, like the only clean thing that had happened to him in years. A kindness with no ledger attached, no favor owed, no name to trade on later. Now 3 years and one impossible coincidence later, he found her on the terrace away from the noise, her cane resting against the stone balustrade, her face turned toward the sound of the party behind her like she was still cataloguing the room by ear. "The stairwell," he said without preamble, because he'd learned tonight that she didn't waste time on the soft entrances. "November, 3 years ago. A building on Delacroix. You told me pain moves in waves." He heard her go very still. "That was you. That was me. I never knew if you—" She stopped. Something in her face had come undone, briefly, before she caught it and folded it back into place. "I walked away, and I never knew if you made it." "I made it," he said, "because you stayed." The wind moved between them, and neither of them filled it. "I'm not choosing you tonight because of a rooftop," he said finally. "I want to be clear about that. I'm choosing you because I've spent 3 years listening for a voice I was afraid I'd imagined. I'd like the chance to choose you again, on purpose this time, with your name in the daylight, and see if you'll let me." The courtship, if that was even the word for it, didn't look like anything Lucia had been raised to expect. There were no photographers, no dinners built for other people to witness. In the first week, Enzo sent no flowers at all, which our aunt found scandalous, and Lucia found, privately, like the first honest thing anyone had done for her in years. When he finally did send something, it was a recording, a woman reading a novel aloud, the kind of audiobook Lucia had mentioned once in passing on the terrace. without expecting anyone to have been listening closely enough to remember. He had been listening closely enough to remember everything. He learned, without asking her to explain it, that she counted steps in unfamiliar rooms and hated being steered by the elbow, preferring a forearm offered rather than taken. He learned it by watching her flinch once, the first week, when his driver reached for her arm at a doorway, and by never letting it happen again. He learned that she liked her coffee described to her by temperature and weight before anyone told her what was in the cup, because hot in a heavy mug told her more than the word coffee ever did. He never made a performance of any of it. He simply adjusted the way you'd adjust to weather and moved on. It unsettled his men more than it unsettled her. She heard it in the pauses, the half second too long before someone pulled out her chair, the visible confusion when Enzo waved off help she hadn't asked for, redirecting it towards something she actually needed instead. These were men used to being accommodated. Watching their boss learn patiently to accommodate someone else was apparently its own kind of unsettling event. "They think I've gone soft," Enzo said one evening, amused, not bothered. "Have you?" "No," he said. "I've just stopped being stupid in this one specific direction." She didn't know yet what to do with being wanted like this, attended to, considered, without an invoice attached. 9 years of being useful had trained her to look for the transaction underneath any kindness, the way you'd check a coin for the counterfeit weight. She kept waiting for the moment his patience would run out and reveal what he actually wanted from her. It hadn't come. She wasn't sure yet whether that meant it wasn't there, or whether she simply didn't know how to recognize its absence. At night, alone, she found herself returning to pieces of her childhood. She'd filed away and never revisited, the way you'd avoid touching a bruise to confirm it still hurt. The recital, 3 months of practice for an empty chair with her father's name taped to the back of it. Being introduced to her father's associates, always the same phrase delivered like a compliment that had never once felt like one. "This is Lucia, the sensible one." Sensible being the word her family used in place of unmarriageable. The way people dress up the truth in a nicer coat, so they don't have to look directly at it. The countless nights she'd sat in the car outside some event while Elena was dressed inside, because taking Lucia in was more trouble than the optics were worth. And nobody had bothered finding a version of the evening where that math came out differently. She had built an entire self around not being chosen. She didn't yet know what to do with a man who kept doing it anyway, deliberately, in the daylight, exactly as he'd promised. Her father, meanwhile, was coming apart in a much less private way. Renzo Bianchi had spent 30 years understanding exactly how to leverage his daughters, and none of that understanding applied here. Elena's beauty had been currency. He knew how to spend. Dinners, introductions, the careful management of who saw her and when. Lucia had never been currency. She'd been an afterthought bundled in to sweeten a deal. And now the deal had inverted itself without his permission. And he had absolutely no idea how to insert himself into a match he hadn't built. He tried anyway. A phone call to Enzo's office, framed as fatherly concern, fishing for details about the wedding date, the dowry conversation, anything that might let him reclaim a seat at a table he'd been quietly excluded from. He tried Lucia directly, once, over dinner, his voice doing the warm performative thing it always did right before he wanted something. "You should let me speak to him about the arrangements, Kara. There are things a father should handle." Lucia, who had spent 9 years learning to read her father's intentions through tone alone, said nothing, which he correctly understood as a no and incorrectly assumed was temporary. He wasn't the only one circling. Dominic Vitale requested a private meeting with Renzo within the month. Polite, unhurried, the kind of request that arrived through a third party and therefore couldn't be refused without insult. He asked over drinks neither man particularly wanted, about old paperwork, old debts, arrangements that predated Enzo's rise to power, back when the Moretti seat had changed hands in circumstances people still spoke about carefully, if at all. Renzo, flattered to be asked anything by anyone again, didn't notice, or didn't let himself notice, that Vitale wasn't interested in him at all. He was interested in what Renzo might still be holding that could someday be useful against the man who'd just taken Renzo's least valuable daughter and made her, overnight, the most valuable thing in the family. Vitale filed the meeting away, exactly where he'd filed the ballroom, weeks earlier. Not useful yet. Not yet. Enzo brought Lucia to the water on a Tuesday that wasn't a holiday or an occasion, in a car with no driver, to a stretch of coast with no name she recognized, and, as far as she could tell from the quiet, no other people. "There's nothing here," she said, amused when he described it to her. "Just rock and tide, and a wind that smelled like salt and old wood." "That's the point," he said. "No one to see us. No one to report back to. I wanted to bring you somewhere that had nothing to do with either family." He described the color of the water to her without being asked. Gray, going to green. Further out, he said, like something deciding what it wanted to be. And she sat on the rock beside him and listened to the tide move in and out, unhurried, indifferent to marble floors and chandeliers and the arithmetic of daughters. For the first time since the ballroom, she didn't feel like she was being evaluated, chosen, or explained. She simply felt present, the way furniture never gets to feel, and she let herself, carefully, believe it might last. Little found what he was looking for on a Thursday. In a box of records Renzo Bianchi had been careless enough to think nobody would ever ask about again. It wasn't hidden well. That was the thing about men like Renzo. They didn't bury their sins. They just filed them under something boring enough that nobody would think to look. The ledger was labeled Consulting Miscomfus. 3 years of small transactions that meant nothing on their own. Vitale had gone through it twice before the entry caught him. A payment, modest, dated in November, 3 years back. No name attached to the recipient, just a location, a cross street on Delacroix, and a note in Renzo's handwriting, cramped and hurried, the kind of note a man writes when he's doing something he doesn't want to remember doing. L placement confirmed. Await outcome. Vitale sat with it for a long moment before he understood what he was holding. He hadn't been looking for this. He'd been looking for old debts, old leverage, the ordinary currency of men who'd spent decades trading favors in rooms like the one this family kept its records in. What he found instead was better than leverage. It was a story, and stories were worth more than debts, because debts could be paid off, and stories could not. He didn't need much more than the date in the street to build the rest of it himself. And when he made a call to confirm the shape of his suspicion, the confirmation came easily. Men talk, when the right amount of money asks them to. 3 years ago, Renzo Bianchi had known through channels he kept carefully unofficial that a war was coming for the Moretti seat, and that the young man about to inherit it might not survive the night his own cousin had planned for him. Renzo had made a bet with no real cost to himself. If Enzo died, the Bianchi family owed him nothing and had lost nothing. If Enzo lived, Renzo wanted there to be a thread connecting his family to the survival, something soft, something that could never be traced back to a transaction, something a dangerous man might remember with gratitude instead of suspicion. A blind daughter sent to a stairwell on the pretext of a friend's building, with instructions no more explicit than sit near the noise. See what happens. Renzo hadn't told her why. He never told Lucia why she did anything. He'd simply arranged the world around her the way he arranged everything, and let her walk into a story she thought was her own choice. She had never known. Vitale was almost impressed by that part. The old man had built an entire gamble on the back of a daughter innocent enough to make it look like decency. And it had worked. Exactly as well as decency was supposed to. He brought the ledger to Enzo 4 days later, in private, with the particular gentleness men use when they want a piece of bad news to do maximum damage. "I thought you should see this before someone less careful did," Vitale said, and slid the ledger across the table open to the page, his finger resting just beside the entry as if pointing it out were an act of friendship. "I know how it looks. I wanted you to hear it from someone who isn't trying to sell you anything." Enzo read it twice. The second time was to see if the words might rearrange themselves into something less ugly. They didn't. "She was sent," Vitale said quietly, when the silence had gone on long enough to need filling. "I'm not saying she knew. I have no reason to think she did. But her father gambled your life to buy himself a foothold. And whatever she gave you that night, whatever it meant to you, it started as a transaction he made without her knowledge and without your consent. A pause, precisely timed. I only think you deserve to know what you're building. A marriage on top of." Enzo said nothing. He was already somewhere else. Back on a landing 3 years cold, replaying a voice he'd carried for 3 years like a relic, trying to find the seam where a stranger's kindness ended and her father's arithmetic began. and finding to his rage that he couldn't locate it cleanly. That was the splinter of it. The part that would not leave once it was in. Not that she'd been sent, but that he could no longer be certain how much of that night had been her, and how much had been Renzo's hand, moving her like a piece on a board she never knew existed. His fury, when it came, went first and hardest toward Renzo. Cold, immediate, the kind of anger that didn't need to raise its voice because it had already decided what it was going to do about it. But underneath the fury sat the splinter, small and stubborn, refusing to be reasoned with. She never told you. 3 years of silence, weeks of courtship, an entire coastline confessed to her without her once mentioning that the stairwell might not have been an accident at all. He didn't go to her that night. He told himself it was strategy, that confronting Renzo required a clear head, that Lucia deserved better than being questioned while he was still burning. He told himself several things. None of them were the truth, which was simpler and uglier. He didn't trust himself yet to look at her and know whether he was looking at the woman on the rock at the water, or the daughter of a man who'd learned to spend her like currency before she'd even known she had value. Lucia felt the change before he said a word. She always did. She'd built her whole life on reading what people wouldn't say out loud. And Enzo's silence over the next 2 days had a different weight to it than his ordinary quiet. Colder, more deliberate, a door easing shut instead of standing open. Something's wrong, she said the third night when he'd walked her to the car without offering his arm the way he always did, without describing the sky or the temperature or any of the small unnecessary kindnesses that had become without her noticing the architecture of how he loved her. Tell me what changed. Nothing's changed, he said, and the lie sat between them so plainly that she didn't need her eyes to see it. You're lying to a blind woman, she said quietly. That should be harder than you're making it look. He didn't answer, and for the first time since the ballroom, Lucia Bianchi stood in a silence she couldn't read at all, and understood that whatever had shifted, he wasn't going to be the one to tell her what it was. The families gathered at the Comtesse's table twice a year, and everyone who mattered understood what the table was actually for. Not dinner, not diplomacy, not really. It was a courtroom that never called itself one, a place where things got said out loud, in front of enough witnesses that nobody could later claim they'd been misquoted. Lucia sat beside Enzo, close enough to feel the tension in him that had not eased in 4 days, and she still didn't have a name for it. She'd asked twice more since the car. Both times he'd given her the same nothing, wrapped in different, gentler words, and both times she'd let it go. Not because she believed him, but because she hadn't yet found the angle to make him stop lying. She found out what it was in front of 40 people, the way she'd learned most things about her own life, second-hand, in a room built for someone else's benefit. Vitale rose before the second course, unhurried, the ledger already in his hand like he'd simply happened to be carrying it, and set it on the table where the candlelight would catch the page. Before we go further tonight, he said, pleasant, almost apologetic, I think this family deserves to know what it's welcoming into the fold. He read the entry aloud. The date, the street, the note in Renzo's handwriting, placement confirmed. Await outcome, spoken into a silent room like a verdict already reached. Signor Bianchi, Vitale went on, turning the warmth up exactly enough to make it cruel, has apparently been playing a longer game than any of us gave him credit for, sending his blind daughter into a stairwell the night Enzo Moretti was nearly killed. A gamble either way, wasn't it? If the boy died, no debt. If he lived, a daughter's voice in his memory forever, and a Bianchi foothold in the Moretti family, bought for the price of one evening's risk. He let that sit. The only question I have for the room is whether the bride even knew she was the currency. Lucia felt every face turn toward her without needing to see it. She felt her father's silence 3 seats down, which told her everything the ledger hadn't, that it was true, that he'd known, that 9 years of being furniture had apparently been a long setup for this one use of her after all. She opened her mouth. She had no idea yet what was going to come out of it. Enzo spoke first. It's true, he said into the silence, flat and unhurried. The same voice she'd first heard cross a marble floor toward a couch nobody had bothered to dress. The ledger is accurate. Renzo Bianchi sent his daughter to that building 3 years ago, gambling with her life and mine, to buy himself a debt either way it fell. He let that land before he continued, and Lucia, listening for the shape of where this was going, heard something in him she hadn't heard since before the silence started. Not fury exactly, but its foundation, patient and total. What Signor Vitale left out, Enzo said, is that Renzo never told his daughter why she was there. He sent a woman he had spent her whole life calling sensible, his word not mine, ask anyone at this table who's heard him use it, into a building where men were actively trying to kill someone, and he never once considered what it might cost her if it went wrong. Boom! He was gambling with a daughter he'd already decided was worth less than the deal she might buy him. He turned finally toward Renzo, and his voice didn't rise because it never needed to. You spent 9 years treating both your daughters as currency. You dressed one to be sold and left the other in the car. And when the one you thought was worthless turned out to be the only thing in your family with a spine, you didn't apologize. You started calculating how to spend her too. Renzo said nothing. There was, Lucia thought, a particular kind of silence, a man made when he'd run out of performances. There's a difference. Enzo said, quieter, now turned back toward the table, though Lucia understood, felt it in the angle of his voice, that he was speaking to her as much to the room, between being sent somewhere and choosing to stay. Her father sent her to that stairwell for his own reasons, and I won't pretend otherwise. But she didn't know that. She sat down next to a bleeding stranger with no name and no reason to expect anything back, and she stayed for an hour because staying was the decent thing to do, and she has never once, in the weeks I've known her, done a single decent thing because it was profitable to do so. That's not a woman playing a long game. That's a woman who was used by her own father and never told. And I would ask this room to remember the difference before it decides who to blame for tonight. He looked, finally, to Vitale. As for you, I'd be curious how deep you dug into an allied family's private ledgers to find this. I'd be curious what else you've been digging for, and from whom, and why a man with no bride at this table and no stake in this marriage has spent this much effort trying to break it in front of witnesses. He let the question hang exactly as long as Vitale had let his. That's not alliance business. That's a man building leverage against a family he hasn't decided yet whether to trust. I think this table should remember that too. The room's attention, which had arrived at Lucia like a verdict, moved by the end of the speech to somewhere else entirely, to Renzo diminished, and to Vitale, who had walked in holding a knife, and was now the only one at the table visibly bleeding from it. He'd wanted to expose a marriage. He'd exposed his own hand instead, and every face at that table would remember, long after tonight, exactly whose interests he'd been serving when he stood up with that ledger. Under the table, without a word, Enzo found Lucia's hand and held it. Not for the room this time. For her. Lucia stood before anyone in the room had decided whether she was allowed to. She rose without Enzo's arm, without her cane finding a hand to guide it, planting the tip against the marble, and letting the room hear exactly how steady she was on her own. She had spent her whole life being spoken about at tables like this one. Her father narrating her worth downward, her sisters narrating it upward. Everyone in her family fluent in a language where she was the subject and never once the speaker. She was done waiting for someone to translate her. I'd like to say something, she said, and the room, which had just watched two men fight a war over her, went quiet in a different register than before. Not the held breath quiet of spectacle, but something closer to attention. My father seems to think I didn't know what he was doing to me, both times. She turned her face toward where she knew Renzo was seated, chin level, the way her mother had taught her before there was no one left to remind her. I didn't need my eyes for that, Papa. I've never needed them to understand you. I knew 3 years ago that you didn't send me to that building because you trusted me with something important. I knew because you'd never once in my whole life trusted me with anything you thought mattered. I went anyway, not because I believed your reasons were good. I didn't know your reasons at all, but because there was a man on that landing who sounded like he'd run out of them, and I decided on my own that staying was the kind thing to do. That was my choice. You didn't buy it, you didn't earn it. You were simply standing near it when I made it. She let that settle before she went on, and nobody in the room moved to fill the silence, which she noted, privately, was new. Tonight is no different. I heard the letter read aloud, same as everyone else at this table. I understood exactly what it meant, same as everyone else. and I'm telling this room plainly, so no one has to guess at it later. Whatever my father gambled that night, whatever he hoped to buy, he didn't buy me. He never has. I'm not a debt collected on. I'm not a foothold. I sat with a stranger because it was decent, and I'm standing here now, in front of people who've spent my whole life deciding what I was worth without asking me, to tell you that I get to decide that. Not him, not the ledger. Me. She turned finally, toward where Enzo stood, though she couldn't see him and had never needed to in order to find him in a room. And for anyone still wondering whether I'm here because I was sent or because I'm choosing to stay, I'm choosing. I've been choosing since the moment I sat down next to him on that landing. He just didn't know my name for 3 years, and I didn't know I'd been the reason he made it to see me learn his. The silence that followed didn't have the shape of scandal anymore. It had settled into something else, the particular quiet of a room recalibrating who deserved its respect. Lucia felt a change around her the way she felt weather change, and understood, for the first time in 28 years, that the recalibration was in her favor. Renzo Bianchi did not recover the room that night. He tried, once, to speak, some reflexive grasp at reframing, an old man's last instinct to narrate his way back into relevance, and found that nobody at the table was interested in hearing from him anymore. 2 of his oldest allies exchanged a look. Lucia couldn't see, but could hear in the shift of their chairs, and by the time the families began to disperse, Renzo Bianchi was standing alone near the door, the way his daughter had once sat alone on a couch. Nobody bothered to dress, and nobody moved to walk him out. Later, on the terrace where he'd first told her about the stairwell, there was no room left to perform for. No families, no ledgers, no cousins in emerald silk waiting to see who'd been chosen. Just the 2 of them, and the tide somewhere below, unhurried, indifferent to marble floors and everything that had been decided inside them. "You didn't need me to defend you in there," Enzo said. "I want you to know I noticed that." "I know you noticed," Lucia said. "You've been noticing things about me since the 2nd week. It's a little late to start being surprised by it." He laughed, quiet, the sound catching on something that might have been relief. "I need to ask you something, and I want the honest answer, not the one that makes tonight easier." "All right. Are you staying because I chose you first? On that rooftop, at that ballroom, because I keep choosing you before you get the chance to choose anything for yourself?" Lucia considered it, turning her face toward the sound of the water, the way she'd once turned it toward a stranger's voice on a landing. Unhurried, certain. "No," she said. "I'm staying because for the first time in my life, someone let the choosing be mine. You didn't pick me off a couch. Nobody dressed. You waited a whole ballroom out to hear if I'd say yes on my own. And then you did it again tonight, standing there letting me speak instead of speaking for me. That's the part I'm choosing, Enzo, not the rescue. The room you keep leaving open for me to walk into on my own feet." He didn't answer with words. He reached for her hand, not to guide it anywhere, not to steer her through a doorway she had asked help with, and simply held it. The way you'd hold something you had finally stopped being afraid of losing. And for the first time in her life, Lucia Bianchi stood in a room with someone looking directly at her, and didn't need her eyes to know with complete certainty that she was finally fully seen.